Hello, my name is Ben Beattie and welcome to the Powerlines podcast. Chris Yeoman has asked me to step in for a little while during this reset of the series and hopefully I'm up to the challenge. First, a little bit about me. I'm an electrical engineer with 20 plus years in the power and gas sector, and I'm deeply skeptical about the direction our current policies are taking us. I hope you'll join Chris and myself as we speak with plenty of interesting guests, and we'll try and get past the jargon, talk about the stuff that really matters to normal people. It's been a crazy few weeks in energy policy in Australia. Obviously, we've had the taxation, which has taken centre stage, but we will get back to energy as we always do. Energy is life. Doomberg is a character from the States, a great interview, and we'll be talking to him in a couple of weeks as well. Chris, welcome.
Ben, good to be with you.
You've been travelling in the last couple of weeks, and you've been talking to some interesting people. You've been out in the bush. You've been down in, where was your energy producers conference? Was that in Adelaide?
Yeah, that was Adelaide. So in the course of last week, Ben, I went from Walker in New South Wales, which is on the tablelands there, New England, some of the most beautiful country in New South Wales, and then went from there down to Adelaide to the Australian Energy Producers Conference. But Walker was really interesting because you'll be well aware, and many of the people who tune into this will be well aware of the big renewable energy zones that are being built. So the idea is to try and cluster these things, then connect them with giant transmission lines. But when you go and look at what's actually going on in New England, and we were invited there by a really great community group called Voice for Walker, where they've done an enormous amount of research on what's been happening there. And we've seen essentially the business model for wind energy collapse as prices rise. There were 9 different projects there that were all supposed to be connected. Well, none of them have gone ahead. Nothing's really been built there in the last 5 years, and yet this is on the drawing board. But the really disturbing thing, Ben, is that the 2 big power lines, and so these are 500 kV power lines. These are giant transmission lines that's going to stretch across the landscape. 2 of them are going to connect to a zone where there is no wind assets. And by the way, that the wind assets that they see that originally they thought they were pretty good assets, but even under the modelling that's been done since, these are C-grade assets, right? These things aren't particularly good. There are a lot of frosts in that region, and you'd know when you get a frost, you don't get any wind. So what's happening is that Energy Co, which is the New South Wales government agency, is determined to push ahead with building these power lines to connect to nothing. And again, once those power lines are built, that's going to be put on everyone's electricity bill in New South Wales with a regulated return for 25 years. So no power, but cost. I mean, Ben, you couldn't make this stuff up.
Chris, you're talking to the farmers and the people out there, and you've also done some filming and proper sort of to air interviews. The sentiment amongst the people out there is very much, this is not going to happen over our dead bodies, basically. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's white hot rage. And again, Ben, you'd know that this is not just in Walker that we're seeing this. This is right around the country. And the thing that people have got to start getting through their heads in this conversation is that all energy is a trade-off, right? So when we went from really dense sources of power, those old coal-fired power stations, we could isolate them in a certain part of the country. We could connect them by transmission lines to the centres that are drawing that power. They were very simple. We knew how to operate them. But then we've decided, no, we're not going to use that coal anymore. So the different energy source we're going to use is dispersed. It's intermittent. It's spread out. It has to be spread out over a landscape because, of course, it doesn't function when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. You've got to overbuild it everywhere. Then you've got to spread these transmission lines to connect it, to get it back to the places where people are actually using that energy. The trade-off is, in order to save the planet, we are literally destroying thousands of hectares of Australia's natural landscape. And the place in Walker is gorgeous, right? This is the New England tablelands, Ben. This is some of the best farming country in the world, some of the most beautiful natural habitats in the world. These things are going to go through koala habitats. And I think I'd noticed Ben, is the deafening silence of the city-based environmental warriors when it comes to worrying about what's going on in land clearing for wind and solar. Don't hear anything. Now, if a farmer did what is being proposed in that region, they'd be prosecuted.
Chris, it's an incredible contrast between what the government wants, what the renewables lobby wants, and what the inner city, dare I say it, the Teals and Greens politicians want versus what the people out there in the farms actually want. When you're talking to these people, do they has anyone come to them and said, "Well, this is why you guys need to make another sacrifice"? Is there anything in the conversation that's leading them to be convinced that this is a good idea?
And Ben, there's always consultation, right? But it's consultation where the outcome's already been decided. Let's face it, like they drew a big circle on a map. They called it a renewable energy zone in New England, and that's where it's going to go. There's no conversation about it not being there. It's just a conversation about how it's going to be there. And you know what their real fear is, of course, is that with the power lines, there's going to be compulsory acquisition anyway of their land. There's no way around that. But their fear is because these wind farms have fallen over as an economic prospect, that billions more of taxpayers' money is going to be put into this zone to build these wind turbines, these uneconomic wind turbines, to connect to the power lines. Why? Because you're building the power lines. And I think, Ben, you're right across this. But don't you think, I'd be really interested in your view on this, is that the wheels are popping off the renewable energy transition all over the country? All of these projects which were promised are behind schedule, ridiculously over budget, none more so than Snowy Hydro 2.0, which has gone from 2 billion to potentially $40 billion will be spent on that project as it's delayed year after year. And of course, it's written into the plan, isn't it, Ben?
It is, and people do mistake this plan for something that's actually real. When we're talking about the plan, it's actually the integrated system plan. And Chris, we've talked about this a lot in the past, but I'll just sort of explain it for the listeners here. In terms of this plan, it doesn't start. It's not projecting. It's not modeling what's going to happen in the future. What it does is it starts with a demand scenario. So they AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, they sit down and they come up, okay, we're going to have this much demand at this point in the future. And then they make several scenarios of various levels of demand. What they do then, and this is one of my favorite parts, they get a bunch of, I would unkindly perhaps call them vested interests, transmission companies and renewables lobbyists and, even maybe a couple of consumer groups, but it's very light on the consumer side. They get these people in and they vote. And they call this a Delphi, whatever it is, process. It's a popularity contest. So the transmission companies go, yeah, we like the high demand scenario. We're going to vote for that. So they get all these weightings and they go, okay, this is the most likely scenario. These are key terms, most likely. And then they call that step change. Step change becomes the optimal development path. When you get to the point, and then they take all the government targets from all the states and all the feds, Chris Bowen, Lily D'Ambrosio, Matt Keane, all those geniuses who know exactly what to do with the energy system. They go, well, here's our 82%, blah, blah, blah. Then AEMO take that as a given. They then split up the mix of wind and solar and batteries, all the rest of it, and go, okay, here's what we're going to have in 2030, 2050, etc., to meet those targets. What's then comes, and the true purpose of the integrated system plan is to initiate the transmission projects required to connect all those renewables projects to meet the targets based on the demand scenarios voted on by the transmission companies. So I hope I've drawn that in the lines between that fairly clearly, because those hundreds or thousands of pages and all the effort can be condensed down into that process.
Yeah, you did, Ben, but let's underline this part. Let's underline this part, and you're really, really good at understanding this. When people say this is the least cost pathway, let's be under no illusion. The way that the energy market operator has drawn this up is based on the government's targets, isn't it? So it is, they haven't looked at every possible scenario to deliver the lowest cost electricity that they possibly can to everyone. They have deliberately narrowed themselves completely into the government's zone, haven't they?
That's 100%. So I even said this in a wind farm inquiry on a planning panel in Victoria last week for the Hexham wind farm. The 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 people on the panel were very surprised, I think, to hear me say this, which is that this least cost pathway, which is the term that's thrown around a lot, and you'll hear it everywhere, is really confined within the guardrails of government policy. So within the government policy, the least cost option is what AEMO is looking at. They're not looking at refurbs on coal. They're not looking at nuclear. They're not looking at any bloody thing actually, except how to meet the targets. And this when you're talking to people who have an open mind about this, or particularly people who might be inclined to be a bit skeptical of government, we're in a low trust environment, I think, politically, where especially after COVID and all the stuff that goes on there. We're in the situation where when they realise it, that's when the rage really starts because they realise they've been taken advantage of.
Yeah, Ben, and the other thing too is aren't we now seeing a growing gap between all that stuff that's on plan? So the renewable energy zone in New England's one of them. There's no wind farms there at the moment, but that's locked into this plan. It's on a time frame. That's the other thing too, is we're not just going to hit these targets. We're going hell for leather. We've pressed the pedal to the metal. We're going to get to 80% renewable energy on the eastern grid. The most important piece of infrastructure we've got on the east coast of Australia. We're doing brain surgery on it, according to a plan where the timetable's not being met. And everywhere, we just saw this week, didn't we, Ben, that the offshore wind in Victoria has now been pushed back again. But isn't that also written into the plan?
Well, they have to keep updating the plan to meet these new targets. Like snowy hydro is another example of something that's going to take a lot longer and cost a lot more. Unfortunately, when we're talking about the costs, a lot of these things they don't start the accounting until after these things are assumed to be built in their estimates, which were entered into the modelling, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So there's a whole lot of extra cost in there, which everyone knows about, but doesn't make it into these figures. Chris, I wanted to leave the conversation about because we got from farmers in Walker to integrated system plan and renewables, and
Yeah.
we could get really really
Get a
deep
little bit
and dark on
distracted.
that, and we could really slander some people in there. That'd be, we could do that offline. That'd be fun over a beer or so. Actually, I was trying to think of a joke the other day. What do you get when you get an engineer and a journalist in a bar? I don't know, but they have a good
What do you
time. They
get?
can't remember anything. They fix the world's problems, and then they can't remember it the next day because they drank too much. Uh, you mentioned the Australian energy producers, and this is the gas lobby. So this is the gas companies, your Santos, Origin, Shell, etc., and a bunch of smaller ones. There's been a lot of attacks on the gas companies lately, particularly about increasing taxation. But we've also had a little bit of pushback. We've had a gas tax inquiry, which some interesting revelations came out. The Australian Tax Office was in there. The Shell CEO of Australia was in there, but we've also had the producers, the Australian Energy Producers Lobby Conference, which you attended, and you were on the panel, and you were talking to some people. I've been talking to some people in the background who were there who said that the sentiment was relatively positive. Can you give us a breakdown of the event and what was going on?
Yeah, I think there's been a big shift, Ben. We've seen that the world has started to wake up to the fact about where its energy sources really come from after the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and people are beginning to recognize the fact that, gee, we really do still use a lot of this liquid fuel in Australia, and gas is really seriously important. So the conversation has changed at a government level. Now, you think about some of those governments, you're talking about Victoria, certainly New South Wales, where they were actively trying to stop the exploration of gas in those states. They've done it very effectively. There still really isn't anything coming out of there. However, the conversation's changed. They now know they need the gas. By the way, if they'd consulted the Australian Energy Market Operator's Integrated System Plan, they would have seen that gas was in fact written into the plan, absolutely necessary for the plan to 2050 and beyond. But that had escaped the attention of the energy ministers in Victoria and New South Wales. And guess what? Lo and behold, there's a gas crisis and they need the gas. So bad was the crisis that they're starting to build liquefied natural gas import terminals in New South Wales and Victoria to overcome the fact that they need the gas, they want the gas, they're going to use the gas, they're just not going to use Australian gas. They want to pay the international price for it. But so with all this bubbling away, there is a sense in the industry that there's an enormous opportunity for Australia. Giant hydrocarbon hole has just opened up in the world's marketplace. No matter what happens in the Strait of Hormuz, nobody is going to be sending ships back in there in the near future because you won't be able to get insurance. Do you think a single sailor is going to want to go back into the Strait of Hormuz if it could be closed again? So that is going to be a permanent disruption to an enormous amount of supply. So 20% of the world's oil, 20% of the world's gas. The world is retooling around it now, and governments are starting to gear up for it. So we've seen the United States, which is an energy superpower, sending out more oil from the Gulf coast of the United States. We've seen the Canadian Prime Minister have a come to Jesus moment where now he wants to build an oil pipeline to the West Coast to get into the Asian market. So he's on board with that. There'll be gas coming from Alaska. Now, Australia could capitalize on this, Ben. This is an enormous opportunity for this country to use its wealth of resources to support our region. And by the way, let's not forget, when we put gas into a marketplace where people quite often use coal, you cut the carbon emissions. You make nations energy secure. A huge opportunity there. But Ben, what do they believe? These people believe the biggest obstacle to all this is it's government. Now, not now the state government will certainly, but it is bad government policy. And the things that you mentioned is, okay, so we've seen a few step moves here. One is that the people who always hated gas and wanted banned have started a new campaign. Why? Because they recognise they've lost the argument on having gas. So they want to tax it at 25% to make sure that there is no new production. So that's one argument. By the way, that's just starting. That's going to go forever. That's going to put an enormous amount of heat on the federal government and on state governments. So that's got a long way to go.
Great.
The other thing too is when the government ditched that idea, when Anthony Albanese came out in Western Australia and said, no, we're not going to do that, hot on the heels of that came the government's gas reservation plan. And this is essentially a reservation plan for the East Coast. And it's a reservation plan not for Queensland, it's got heaps of gas, right? It's New South Wales and Victoria, which starve themselves of gas, which means the prices rise.
Which is going to penalise, which penalises Queensland producers because if they have to produce, they're not going to be asked to produce extra. They're not going to be allowed to produce extra. They're just going to be just told to reserve some and send it south through a skinny pipeline to Victoria, which won't even happen because let me break it there, because this is really bugs me when people, not you, but the general population think,
the pipeline's big.
Gas. We'll reserve the gas in on the east coast of Australia. That'll help. Okay, so when you're talking about reserving the gas, well, where is the gas? They're only talking about the export gas, and that can only go out of Gladstone in Queensland. You have to get it there from the coal seam gas fields in central and western southern Queensland. But if you're going to reserve some of that to solve the problem's not in Queensland. The problem's in Victoria in winter, where we are now in the dark doldrums. I mean, I did some analysis the other day and showed that if your lawn shuts down in 2028, the 1st of July 2028, like it's meant to, Victoria's in big doo-doo, to be honest. But if you reserve that gas and stop it being exported from Queensland, then you have to get it to Victoria. Now you can ship it, but then you've got to liquefy it and ship it, and that's very, very expensive. Then you build an import terminal in Melbourne, or maybe, I don't know, in Gippsland somewhere. Then the way it gets there now is through pipeline. So you go west of Brisbane, you get out to Moomba, and then you head south down through South Australia and down onto Sydney. But there's no direct pipeline from the gas fields in Queensland to the consumers in Melbourne and Victoria. This is the problem. That gas pipeline is largely at capacity in this very period we're talking now, which is, at the end of May, start of June. This is when the high demand starts. So even if you have more gas, you can't physically get the stuff where it needs to be used in order to alleviate the high prices. And it bothers me that the politicians, you can understand that pretty easily, right? You're no dum-dum. It doesn't take an engineer or any kind of genius to realize that, you can't just put more through a pipeline. There are some more small capacity increases coming, but it's just very, it's a bit of a problem when we get to the point where the gas tax and the reserve debate. My phone's ringing. Don't worry about it. Reserve debate talk about getting gas from Queensland to Victoria as if that's going to save a problem when you can't actually get it there. I don't know. What are these people thinking?
Yeah, Ben. Well, but the thing is that if you look at everything that we're talking about, it's all a patch up job for bad policy. So every single solution is to try and fix a bad decision that was made some time ago. And bad decisions were made in Victoria and in New South Wales. But by this is bipartisan. It is a bad government in Victoria made bad decisions and actually put in their constitution that you couldn't do any fracking in Victoria. They try to lock this stuff up. Once they do it, they try to lock it up forever, that no one can ever revisit this stuff. Now they're finding there are really big issues. And in New South Wales, same thing. Bad energy policy, which means there's effectively a ban on getting gas out of the ground. Like Narrabri has been there for ages. This is run by Santos, right? And Kevin Gallagher from Santos said essentially, like, they have had to write off $1.5 billion. Like, this is not money that can be recouped, right? They have written off over 15 years, $1.5 billion of investment to try and get that gas in New South Wales up and running. So everything is a patch up job. Now, the fear of the industry is at the moment is that we'll get more bad policy to try and fix it, right? The best thing that Victoria and New South Wales could do is to get as quickly as they possibly can more output from the fields that are already there. So Gippsland, you can squeeze a bit more out of that, but you've got to look for more gas. But quietly, Ben, behind the scenes, as much as Lily D'Ambrosio always refers to fossil gas rather than natural gas, the government in Victoria has opened up a bit more room for there to be a bit more gas coming out of fields in Victoria.
Of course they
So
do.
don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do. And same in New South Wales. They're now actively looking to try and get more gas out of the ground. So this is good news. This is tremendous news. We just need government to get out of the road.
Well, you when we were talking about what we're going to talk about today on the phone earlier, you mentioned that Pauline Hanson is actually talking about gas now, and what's the reception to her ideas?
Mate, the thing that was really interesting about this, and it says something broader politically, was right at the very end session. You know, the session where everyone wanders off after lunch and they couldn't be really at most conferences, it's day 3, they're gone. Audience is empty. And earlier in the morning, I had interviewed Angus Taylor on that stage. And I'd say there's 500 seats, just guessing, in that particular venue. I'd say that it was, half to 2/3 full. Pauline Hanson, last session of the day, that venue was chockers, full of people in the industry to hear about her energy policy. Well, I'm no pollster,
really
mate, but that's
yeah.
telling you something. She's being taken extremely seriously about that. Now, when it comes to her policy itself, it's essentially the government's going to take a 30% equity stake in your company. Now, I don't know that that's a great idea. She has, though, consulted with industry. And the thing that she said was important, which the industry certainly heard, was she is in favour of there being more gas. She wants to expand the industry and she's willing to continue a conversation with the industry. And when I talked to the players in the industry, they said, well, we were certainly consulted by her. We've been on phone hookups with her people. That is in sharp contrast to the way they feel that they've been dealt with when it comes to the gas reservation policy, which has been put out by the government. Best line that I heard, though, was one guy say, look, I'm from Victoria. It's not the worst energy policy I've ever seen.
I like the idea, just from a personal political perspective, I'm I'm not able to vote for the centre person anymore. I've tried that down in the past, and and I think a lot of people have, to be honest, and it's led us to where we are now. I don't think you can win from the middle. I think you need to be a little bit on one side, then compromise a bit, and you kind of get it right. I think Pauline's starting in the right space. She's going, well, I'm going to be more aggressive on this than the Libs. The Libs don't seem able to sort of patch a trick in this area. Maybe they'll learn something from Pauline and maybe do a bit more consultation. I do have to point out, I think it was the Victorian Liberal Party who banned gas exploration to start with, and then the Greens just really locked it up by getting into the Constitution, as you mentioned. But Chris, the sentiment at the gas producers lobby at the function, you said was positive. They're getting a bit more aggressive about it.
They're extremely positive. They think things are moving in Australia. They know now that people understand that they need gas. They certainly they were welcomed with open arms into South Australia by Peter Malinauskas, the Premier, and Tom Koutsantonis, who's now the Treasurer, was an Energy Minister. They say that, and they've done a lot of wind and solar, obviously, in South Australia. But none of it, they said, none of it would be possible without gas, and the expansion of the economy in South Australia can't happen without gas. And can I say, by the way, South Australia is now leading the country. The Premier is very proud about it when it comes to the rate at which that economy is growing. Sees a great future, but does not see a future that does not include gas and a lot more gas. Beetaloo Basin's on the move, mate, and so there's a lot of optimism about that. That's in the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory Chief Minister was there. The delegation was there. Go across to Queensland, spoke to the Resources Minister there, Dale Last. Dale Last. His line is, I'll sign, you drill.
Guy, yep.
Yeah, big ball guy. So we're looking at well, I actually think he's got hair, mate. You might be thinking about someone else, but anyway, by the by. But we need to identify who we're talking about, but it's Dale Last, the Resources Minister there is very keen. There were a delegation from the Taroom Trough. They believe that's an enormous resource that is potentially, but look, mate, look, you would know better than me. People always talk up their projects in the early stages, but has the potential to be another basin that's as big as the one off Victoria used to be, which is, of course, because of all that cheap gas that we got out of Victoria off the coast of Victoria for over 50 years meant that's why that Victoria's so gas dependent, right? Because they had cheap gas, helped to power their manufacturing, along with their really cheap coal that they don't want to use anymore.
Yeah, and it's a shame how far it's fallen. And I am a little bit scared that it's going to fall further before we get some sanity in this area. When we're talking about this, we're talking about very sort of state-based products. We've talked about Victorian gas, South Australian. We've talked about Narrabri, which is a 200 TJ project. That's actually really close to my family farm, like northern New South Wales. There, I was born in Tamworth.
All right, mate.
The music
is that why the guitar?
Right?
I need to know, mate, because this is a side of you I was unaware of. So, is it country music you play?
No, I started off as I'm heavy metal. I'm a hard rock guitar guy. So
you'll have to play something for us.
Well, I'm hoping that with the revamp of Power Lines, I can convince your guys to use my opening jingle. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
We're talking about state-based stuff, and we've got Victoria. We know they're a shambles. South Australia is electricity-wise, they're a shambles. But and I think they're hanging on by a thread, to be honest. Queensland seems to be going in the right direction. You mentioned Dale Last. Hair or no hair, I think he's doing a good job. What we should actually talk to him, get him on the show, and see what he wants to do, because Janetsky, David Janetsky is the Energy Minister and Treasurer. He brought the energy portfolio in under the Treasury Department, the Finance Department, at the last election. Now, he was kind of coy about what was going on, but he came up with a energy roadmap, and in it he talked about new gas turbines and gas development and extending the coal, etc. Where I'm getting to with this is part of Janetsky's initial foray into the federal side of things was to tell the market operators and the modelers, please remove Queensland's renewable energy targets from your planning. Now, that, in my opinion, that's thrown the whole thing into a sort of disarray, because Chris Bowen on one side says, yeah, we're going to get net zero. Clearly not, but he still keeps saying it. And the Victorians, Labor guys, Lily D'Ambrosio, still keeps saying it. When is this myth, this magical unicorn, this garden gnome, just going to disappear from the lexicon completely? When is net zero going to die a natural death?
I think effectively it has, when you talk about what's actually happening in the world. And let's make this clear, net zero has got to be a global achievement. And one of the reasons I talk about energy realism is that I got to travel the world with prime ministers. I went to these conferences. I got to eyeball these people and see what they're actually doing as apart to what they say they are doing. And we'll underline this on this podcast. It's always been, we will watch what they do, not listen to what they say, because there's a very big difference between the two of these things. And the world is not doing net zero How do we know that? Well, last year the world burned
They
more
say it.
coal, oil. Yeah, well, the world burned more coal, oil, and gas last year than ever before in human history. Likely will break that record again. Carbon emissions have risen every single year since 1993. When I interviewed Ros Kelly, who was the then Environment Minister for Australia, she went to the Rio Earth Summit where the first agreement on this was struck. And we've been working on that ever since. The world is not serious about net zero. The world is not doing net zero. Now, look, I am not in the business of arguing about climate change. I am prepared to agree with the actual science, and we can debate that another time, mate. But let's just say that's the problem which is driving all of this, right? So let's just accept that's a policy problem. By the way, the actual science rather than the hysteria we get all the time, the answer to that is not an existential threat. We will need to deal with it. What then the question then for us, mate, is what do you do? Do you deal with the world as it really is in the way that you're watching everyone else do their business? Or do you decide that you're going to sacrifice the entire Australian economy on the altar of a project which the world is not on? So we're going to have to deal with
No,
the
I'd
cost
like
of
to
adaptation.
sacrifice.
Yeah, I know. We're going to have to deal with the cost of adaptation. We've decided we're going to spend trillions of dollars on mitigation. Well, it's preposterous, right? And Australia, by the way, rich in natural gas. If we can actually export to the region and drop the amount of coal that's being used in some of these countries, then you will find that the carbon emission footprint begins to fall, as it did in the United States when they did precisely that. They cut the amount of coal. Now, look, I'd use all of our resources, but that's another conversation.
You're absolutely right. So I was having a conversation with a girl at work, a fellow engineer, lovely girl, really get on with her. And then something came up, and I said I'd poo-pooed the idea of net zero somehow. I don't know, one of my Substack articles, maybe, I don't know. And she said, "Really? What do you mean?" And I had to sort of explain it to her. But I don't come on too strong in these conversations, right? Because you don't know how fragile people are when you're talking about these things. You've probably talked to people and they turn around and get really defensive. And I don't want people to get defensive. I want them to look at me and go, I'm obviously I'm an engineer. I'm a professional. Don't want to be seen as a goof. But I think about these things objectively, and objectively, net zero is impossible. You can't do it. When you look at close, and you've mentioned all the global stuff that's going on. When you bring it closer to Australia, the current government doesn't have a plan, a net zero plan. The only net zero plan that's been published by an Australian government that I'm aware of was Scott Morrison in 2018. And when you look into that actual plan, it's called a roadmap or emissions reduction net zero roadmap. Uh, Fully 40%, and you'll see where I'm going with this, 40% of the emissions reduction with hydrogen. So we're replacing liquid fuels with hydrogen. You're replacing electricity supply with hydrogen. You're replacing jet fuels, etc., with hydrogen. Fertilizers, plastics, green steel, hydrogen goes into this. This, as far as coming up with a plan, has anyone asked Chris Bowen, Albo, whoever in the government what the plan is? And, what's wrong with the other plan? Surely they can just make hydrogen work. Isn't it the savior?
Oh, yeah, mate. And whatever happened to green hydrogen? Boy, that dropped off the agenda. There's no one talking about that now. Can I say that in South Australia, one of the things that's happening at the moment is the Malinowskis government is trying to get the ban or moratorium that they had on fracking in the southeast of the state lifted so that they can get gas. What do they want that gas for? Well, they want that gas for Whyalla. Wasn't Whyalla going to run the steelworks there, Ben? Remind me, wasn't that going to run on green hydrogen? What happened to that? What about Curry Curry? Remember Curry Curry? We're going to get a green hydrogen ready. Doesn't even have any gas at the moment. So yeah, like all these.
Yeah, Curry Curry's an interesting one because that was the demise of Paul Broad, former chair of Snowy Hydro. So 3 weeks after Chris Bowen came in, and we should keep a bit out for the editing guys so we can get that in there. But he was very, very upset at Chris Bowen, and I think a lot of it was for forcing green hydrogen into that gas turbine, which went from a $600 million project to a $900 million project. No one really talks about it. But sorry, yeah, Whyalla, green steel, hydrogen, not happening.
And so all around the place, as you say, so I remember that plan very well from Scott Morrison. So the green hydrogen was locked in as something that was going to happen, right? That actually was going to happen. But then there was another step, and you might recall that I had a diagram, which is we got to the point where it is technology. It is like it just said technology improvements, right? And so it's like at the end of your plan, you go,
Magic.
and then magic. And so it is, in order for them to get there, it was like, oh, well, at some point, magic. Like you genuinely, like if you and I deliver this stuff to a high school teacher, well, not in today's education system probably, but in the days when we went through school, people would throw that across the room. Now they'd probably say,
Oh man,
"Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely, Barry. You've done a very good job."
there's going to be a time in history when people look back at this stuff and do a PhD thesis, and it's not going to be the technical people; it's going to be the psychologists. They're going to be looking back and say, "What were they thinking?" I mean, is this a mass psychosis event? Speaking
Yeah.
speaking of that, they had the old IPCC walked back some climate alarmism finally, but no one's really paying enough attention to that anyway. Chris, what
Tell us
else
a
do
bit
we have to
about
talk
that.
about?
Yeah, well,
Oh, well,
that's an interesting one, mate. Yeah, so tell us about that.
Well, the IPCC have these representative concentration pathways, the RCPs, and I think does it come down to watts per square meter as warming? So it's the number is related to some level of warming, and so then they sort of start with these and in these scenarios, and they break them up into different areas. And the worst one, the hottest, with all the flooding and all the crop failures, the locusts and the fire and brimstone, all comes in from this RCP 8.5. Now, the problem with that is that it's to get to that level of warming effect, even according to the IPCC and all the scientists, you need to actually double or triple the amount of coal and gas and oil that you burn in the world. And we know we're not doubling or tripling it. Some people might say that would be a good thing. I would say whatever works best, but they're not. It's an unrealistic scenario. It's not going to happen in any future. But all the alarmist projections and the Al Gore stuff and the Greens and the Matt Keane stuff all comes from this RCP 8.5. Now the an American guy, Roger Pielke Jr. He's an academic and a scientist over there, and he's been banging this drum for a little while now, and I've probably 10 years. He's been concerned that
Mm.
this unrealistic scenario is what governments are using as justification for their spending on renewables and whatever. Um,
Can I just
so, and I
underline
think
that
he's
while you're there,
absolutely
mate? Yeah, I just want to underline that, mate. So essentially what happened was a number of different pathways, worst case scenario, middle scenario, really, really good scenario. Essentially there was the upper limit of, this is the one where the world's going to get to 6 degrees warming. That was actually baked in, and this is Pilkey's always his complaint, as the business as usual scenario. It was never business as usual. They were testing the upper limits of a modelling range. But in almost every single one, including the modelling that we saw from the Australian government coming out last year, even though at that stage everyone knew that it was essentially abandoned, the people who are working for the International Panel for Climate Change, who are setting down the models, now say that model is implausible. And so do we erase? By the way, mate, so one of the things that gets me about this is that all the hysterical rhetoric was attached to that. The modelling now has come down. They're saying that we, between 2 and 3 degrees warming by the end of this century. But the rhetoric has stayed wound up, in fact, got even louder. So as the models are adjusting to what's actually happening, the rhetoric is getting louder. It's like, in case you can't hear me, I'll just shout louder.
well, the narrative has to be maintained, Chris. There's no walking this back. These people are locked in. I wrote about this a little while ago when I talked about, well, why are we here and what kind of people are talking about this stuff. So for my sins, I engage with some of these trolls on Facebook. I got booted out of a Facebook uh, electricity group for, what I like to say, objectively discussing the facts and that with charts, and not even about climate change, and they won't have me back. They don't like me. But there's other Facebook groups out there with a lot of reach. For example, I put one up there on this one of these Facebook groups, which is renewables versus nuclear debate, and you can see what side I always will come down on. And I just pointed out that the wind output in the national electricity market in Australia has been trending down for 12 months. I mean, that's a very interesting point, isn't it? And why would that be? And there'll be any number of reasons for it, but it's not. It's counter to the narrative. And when we're talking about all these people out there who defend the narrative, or why are they defending it? Well, I think a lot of them, for example, like the politicians, have publicly invested so much of their reputational credit, I guess you'd call it, in the narrative that if they change it, they have to walk it back. And I don't think, firstly, their ego won't survive walking it back. Their political life won't survive walking it back. And I guess Chris Bowen's going to go, screw it, I'm just going to go work for the UN.
Oh, mate, I think that's on the cards. By the way, in the budget papers, there's $19 million. $19 million been set aside in a single year. That's the coming financial year for COP31 engagements. You know, I can think of 19 million ways we could spend each one of those dollars better. I'm not interested in Chris Bowen being president of that organisation when this country has serious energy problems. But this is the bottom line with all this sort of stuff too. And I know that let's not debate it now. We can do it some other time. But, you know, you and I probably have different views when it comes to some of the stuff on climate. I'm happy to say that, look, I'll take the mid-range view that they're saying. I'll state that's okay. Let's just take that as that's the trajectory. Let's assume that, and that is a problem. There will be changes. We need to address those changes. I've always said my position is, I've worked around politics for 35 years. You got a problem. What's the policy solution? What's the most sensible policy solution to this particular problem when we take into account everything, plus our own natural resources, plus what the rest of the world's doing? What should Australia do to keep this nation as rich and as prosperous as we possibly can to deal with whatever the future might throw at us? And we've just worked out geopolitics is likely to throw a few more curveballs at us than the long-term problem of climate change. These are short-term issues we need to deal with. That this is not the solution, right, mate? This is simply not the solution. What we are doing is actual madness. Now, what they've done, and all the people involved in this debate, is to essentially equate, if you do not sign up to wind, solar and batteries as the only solution, there can't be any nuclear, can't be gas as a transition fuel, never ever coal, right?
Yep.
So unless you sign up to that, the holy trinity of that solution, then you are a heretic. You are essentially a climate change denier by another name. That is the way this debate is functioning. These people are frauds when it comes to that, because if they actually seriously believe what they were talking about, they'd be pro-nuclear. They'd be trying to get the best, densest net zero, it's not net zero, but zero emissions generation they possibly could into this country as fast as they could. They'd be prepared to pay a premium for it. And by the way, I'll end with this. If it ends up being $42 billion for Snowy 2.0, according to the CSIRO, that's how many? That's 2 really big nuclear power plants.
Biggest and the most expensive, according to the CSIRO. Chris, you're preaching at me, preaching great sense. I love it.
I'm sorry, mate.
We're gonna catch up again soon, and hopefully we'll have another guest dial in as well. You got any last thoughts for the viewers before we wrap up?
No, the only thing I'll say about this is that, Ben, is going to take the lead on this Power Lines podcast. We hope to make it ever bigger and ever better. And we're essentially trying to do this. We recognize that there are many problems. We think that there are probably many solutions, but what we're looking for is energy realism. We believe that we embrace the fact that we use hydrocarbons every single day. We'll try and show you where the hydrocarbons are in your life, because you try living without them, right down to the medicines you use, the shoes on your feet, the concrete paths you walk on, the bikes you ride. Everything makes its way back to hydrocarbons. And we celebrate that fact, and we're going to try and articulate that as well as we possibly can. And Ben, it's your ship, so happy sailing.
Indeed. Thanks, Chris. It's going to be fun. Look forward to it.